Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. Today we continue to work on our reignited Demolition Derby project. Now last time we continued dipping our toes into unfamiliar territory by trying to build the enemy AI for our game. We managed to get some parts working, like movement and turning, but sadly we weren't able to figure out other parts such as collision handling and basically anything that wasn't taking a nice little joyride. And so today we'll be taking a break from the unknown to work on something we actually do know. That's right, today we'll be implementing a feature I've been hush on, and that's weapons. We'll add an assortment of more common weapons that you'd expect to see in a car combat game, and we'll also experiment a little bit with what might be possible in the future. So let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. To start, I set up a cooldown system similar to those we've used in the past. First, focusing on the machine gun style weapon that'll work more as a weaker secondary weapon. The difference between this weapon and the other weapons is that this has to be a hit scan weapon, as opposed to the other weapons which will be projectile based. And so I needed a line of sight, which meant that the collision line was a great place to start. And it worked perfectly, just as I had hoped. However, while testing the code out on the walls, I remembered something from working on the Ape Out clone. Using collision lines can be too precise, and when you're dealing with something like a car, there has to be some leniency with the aiming. So I tried switching over to a collision rectangle. The problem with the collision rectangle though is that it can't be rotated, and try as I might, it just wasn't possible. So I had to resort to a last ditch effort, which was to use a sprite as a hitbox. I created said sprite with the width and length I'd imagined the gunfire would spread, and created a hitbox object. I then spawned and tied that hitbox to the player, having it only last a few frames. Thankfully, this ended up working. Now, two things to note here. The first, that technically no, this is not a laser beam, it's just a makeshift attempt at a hit scan with the knowledge that I have. But lasers aren't off the table as a future weapon. And second, GameMaker's weird behavior with positioning in the step behavior provides a pretty great side effect. The trembling wasn't intentional, but it really helps with the sell of the unexpectedness of automatic fire coming from a vehicle. Anyway, now that our secondary weapon is at least working, it was time to focus on our main weapons. And since all the main weapons I plan to build today are projectile based, we needed a sprite. So I went with a arrow of some sort. I then created a projectile object and gave it a type variable. The variable would define the projectile's behavior, and for testing purposes tied its type to different colors. And just like before, I set up another input check and cooldown for the main weapons. Now going back to the projectile, the first type I wanted to create was a basic rocket. So using the lovely switch function, I had type 0, which would be our default rockets, simply move in the set direction, and that direction would be defined by the player's input. Next, I wanted to build a homing rocket, and for the sake of testing, I wanted them to home in on the walls. The original setup for this was to check for the nearest target, and if the rocket was in range of said target, to begin moving towards it. I then realized that the initial code was terribly inefficient, and so I changed it. I started with setting a base direction, and then gave the projectile a new direction variable. So if we ever need to change trajectory for other weapons in the future, we're golden. This worked much better, and though it's a bit rough around the edges right now, our homing rockets were a go. Now for our third weapon, I wanted to create a napalm projectile. So I added a timer variable to our projectile. When this timer hits its limit, I originally had the projectile destroy itself, but for the sake of making sure things worked, I decided to have it just stop moving instead. I skipped creating an explosion effect for now, since we're mainly focusing on projectile functionality at the moment. And as far as functionality went, indeed, the napalm projectile would first act as a normal rocket, and once it hit the time limit, would cease moving. So, with 3 pretty typical weapons created, I wanted to try something a little crazier, just to see what I could do at the base level. And so I created a flower style projectile which would fire 8 rockets once it hit its time limit. And once I realized that I was severely overthinking the math to do something so simple, we had a flower style explosive rocket. Now, we could have just left it at that, but I wanted to get stupid with it. And so instead of firing regular rockets from the flower rocket, I had it spawn random rockets, which meant that flower rockets could spawn more flower rockets, which would then spawn more flower rockets. And holy moly, I am surprised that my computer did not blow up. So yes, what started as a seemingly normal destruction derby game is slowly becoming more of what I originally planned for it to be. Vehicular mayhem with some ridiculous weapons and more. Though nothing we did today was necessarily groundbreaking, it was nice to work on something familiar for once, and this also means that we're one step closer to adding even more insanity in the future. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our progress in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.